All right, guys, we are live. Want to give you an opportunity to come on into this stream. Do me a favor, just tag, like, share, let people know about this, about the urban perspective. Grateful for everyone. Tag your friends, let them know about this. A very important discussion. And so we really want to get the word out. So you can do us a favor, like, subscribe, share. If you are on YouTube, you can subscribe at YouTube, looking for the urban perspective. You can go there. But I'll give you a few more moments, guys. Go ahead and like this. Be sure to share it. Very important discussion as we talk about several things, looking at our current racial climate, our political climate, and how we should approach this as believers. And so I'm excited, really excited today to be joined by Justin Giboney of the AND campaign. Justin Giboney of the AND campaign, a great leader, a great visionary, and he's going to help us with this conversation today as we think about how we can engage these subjects and what should be the posture of believers. And so really excited that he is here with us today. Justin, welcome to the Urban Perspective.
Jerome, how's it going, man? Thanks for having me.
Man, great, man. Thank you. I'm grateful that you're giving us your time. Really appreciate that. I'm grateful that for your expertise and grateful for the AND campaign. Can you tell my viewers, tell us about the AND campaign? Tell us about your mission, your vision, and some of your values.
Sure. Well, the AND campaign is a Christian civic organization that was founded by myself, Sho Baraka, the hip hop artist, and a pastor named Angel Maldonado. And it's a Christian, it's a Christian civic organization. And really what we're trying to do is reassert a biblical Christian worldview into the political sphere. We think that too often our political landscape separates social justice from moral order. As you know, you have some Christians who say they believe in social justice and others who want to talk more about morality. But when we look at the gospel, it's both, right? It's not an or, it's an and. It's social justice and moral order. It's love and truth, compassion and conviction. And so through educating Christians, raising civic literacy, through kind of coalition building and advocacy, we're trying to get Christians involved in doing politics more faithfully, because we think too often we've allowed our political affiliations to become religious in nature. And it's not that we can't be in parties, but we need to be Christian first, and we're trying to provide Christians with a framework, a biblical framework to do that.
No, that's great. Thank you for sharing that, guys. Again, this is very important conversation. Recently, obviously, as we get closer to a very important election for our country, there's a lot of talks around politics and how Christians should engage. And oftentimes there seems to be a conflation sometimes of politics and the Christian faith. But when you just being an expert in this arena, can you tell us how should Christians engage our current political climate? What is the approach and what is the posture that we should take towards right, the left? What is the posture that we should have?
Yeah, I think understanding that first, you have to put things into perspective, right? So let's start from the beginning. The purpose of the Christian life is, to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ and glorify God. I think that's absolutely true. I don't think you put politics in front of that. However, in no way does that diminish the importance of politics, because the fact of the matter is that politics touches every aspect of society, as we see, whether we can go to church or not, what kids in school, what we eat, things of that nature. And so we should be engaged in it because it just has such an impact on society. And the way that we should engage is by understanding our purpose in the political arena, which I would say comes from the Great Commandment, right? They can have that to love our neighbor as ourselves. And if we're going to love our neighbors as ourselves, then we're going to protect their human dignity. A lot of that has to do with justice. And we're also going to promote human flourishing. So I see that as the purpose of why Christians are involved. And when I look at the parties, neither of them hits on that perfectly. And so I think we should not allow parties to be the masters of our social action, right? If your agenda within the public square is just based on the Republican agenda or the Democratic agenda, you're missing so many things that should be involved in a Christian political witness, right? And that's what we're trying to get folks to see. Like, don't limit by these other folks. Be a Christian first. And if I'm promoting human dignity, then I might have to have a different perspective on immigration than the Republicans. If I'm promoting human dignity, I'm going to have a different perspective of life and the sanctity of life than most Democrats. We have to be willing to frame the issues for ourselves and not leave them in this frame that the parties and ideological tribes create for us.
Yeah, you recently wrote a book called Compassion and Conviction. We want to put that up there for people to see that. I have it here. We were able to get that book. Really excited about just this contribution. And you kind of speak to that. You address that somewhat in the book. There does seem to be a conflation primarily. Now, we're not championing one party above the other. But typically there seems to be a conflation between Christianity and conservatism. Why do so many evangelicals equate conservatism with Christianity?
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I think, unfortunately, a lot of people think ideological conservatism and theological conservatism are the same thing, but they're not, right? You can be theologically conservative and not base your whole political ideology on this kind of rugged individualism, right? That we all pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. And if you haven't done it, that's on you, completely ignoring what's happened throughout history. But to be fair, I think the other part of it is that a lot of evangelicals do value, the pro-life cause. And so I'm not going to take that away from them. I'm not going to say that's a bad thing. I have talked about one-dimensional politics. And so if you want to base your vote primarily on pro-life issues, that's okay. But that's very different than having one-dimensional politics where that's the only thing you see and then you don't fully examine anything else, right? So I want to look at pro-life issues, but I don't really want to talk about racial injustice because I'm just focused on that one thing, and that's everything. I think that type of one-dimensional politics is unfortunate because you're putting an issue in a vacuum and you're actually not even going about that issue the best way you could because you don't see how other issues play into the abortion issue. And so I think we should broaden how we look at things. It's not to say that you have to have the same primary policy views as I do, but I don't think it should just be one dimensional. And on the left, sometimes that could be race, right? Where we create this one dimension and that's the only thing we look at when there are other things outside of that vacuum that have a serious impact.
So you talked about, one-dimensional politics, whether it be, on one side, there seems to be an emphasis on racial injustice. There's the phrase of systemic racism. The other side may deny systemic racism exists or use or throw up things like abortion. Break down. Can you break down the one-dimensional politics that you see or one-dimensional issues that you see on both sides?
Yeah, sure. So I kind of explained it on the right where, hey, we're voting for whoever is pro-life. And as long as the president has done some things for that cause, it's all good. And I'm not worried about anything else. I'm not, again, the issue is not that that's your primary issue that you focus on, right? It's an important issue if that's the primary one you focus on. But if you do it to the exclusion of a full examination of other issues, a full examination of maternal mortality, and we're not looking at how that plays into the conversation about abortion or how the social safety net and whether it's sufficient or not, how that plays into the conversation, or you don't want to just look at racial justice because if you give that a full examination, it complicates your narrative on other issues. So you'd rather just focus on one thing. And on the other end, I see, on the other side of the spectrum, I see that sometimes when it comes to identity in the Democratic Party, right? Where you want to focus so much in on identity or focus on the rhetoric that people are saying about race and identity that you completely cut off a whole lot of other issues. So a lot of Democrats that I know who are Christians don't give enough attention to, the sanctity of life or just kind of use some of those progressive talking points to again, not give it a full examination and really think about how meaningful and impactful it is to communities. So what I'm basically saying is you can have, your issue that you look at and focus on, but not to the exclusion of everything else, right? You still have to look at all the issues and make sure that you're making a judgment that's multidimensional instead of just focused on one thing.
No, that's great. I'm grateful for that clarification. Recently we've had some well-known evangelical leaders tend to apply that same conflation, going as far as to say if you don't vote this way, you're not a true Christian. And I think that when that happens, that adds to the divide. Again, that conflates Christianity with the conservative party. And I like the way Dr. Tony Evans said it, that Jesus isn't riding on donkeys or elephants. He didn't come to take sides. He came to take over. And it's important that we use that biblical worldview, that biblical ethic as we address and as we talk about those things. You mentioned just some of these issues, the disparities that we're seeing from the right, from the left, how, again, that's dividing the body of Christ. And in many ways, I think it's showing the idol of politics. I think God is exposing the idol of politics when we're willing to equate someone's salvation with their vote. But also in there seems to be an argument over terms. And so I want to transition into, the whole Black Lives Matter thing, Black Lives Matter. And I want to look at this, Black Lives Matter, the sentiment versus Black Lives Matter, the organization. And so when it comes to Black Lives Matter, the sentiment, I believe that's an anthropological truth. It's a theological truth. Black is beautiful because Black is biblical, and God has created all people in his image. And so there seems to be an issue if you say or use the hashtag Black Lives Matter, that somehow you're automatically a Marxist, you're a critical race theorist. There doesn't seem to be room for nuance. Whereas you can say, hey, I agree with the sentiment, but I don't affirm every aspect of the organization. Can you break down the difference between the two and then talk a little bit about aspects of the organization that as believers, we should not affirm?
Well, I think you broke it down fairly well yourself, right? Black Lives Matter as a statement, as the idea that Black lives have dignity, that they have worth, that can't be taken away, is a statement that I think all Christians should be able to affirm. Black lives do have dignity, and that dignity should be protected, and that dignity is compromised when we are not treated fairly by the criminal justice system, when we're not treated fairly by police officers and so on. And so that statement should not be hard for anybody to accept and understand. The problem is a lot of people don't want to understand it. And so when you don't want to, when you don't want to understand something, or you don't want to kind of admit the faults of the past, and you find any reasons, you start nitpicking and you start looking for reasons not to affirm what should be affirmed because it may compromise your narrative. I think that's the major problem that we see with a lot of white evangelicals. To say Black Lives Matter is not to say anybody else's lives don't matter. That's been explained ad nauseum. But sometimes when you have a hardened heart and you just, you don't have open ears, you're just not going to hear it. And so a lot of folks don't want to hear it. There's not a whole lot of argument that needs to be had. It's a pretty simple assertion. And those who are open and want to make things better, I think, have been able to say, you know what, Black Lives Matter. That said, there are some problems with the organization. And let me talk about the organization real quick. The first thing I think we need to recognize is that organization, flaws and all, stepped into a void that was left by the church. It stepped into a void to talk about race in ways and bring certain things to life in ways that the church was not at the time. And I'm talking about as a whole. Of course, there were individual Christians and churches who were, but I'm talking about the larger church was just not present. We know very clearly that a lot of white evangelicals, conservative Christians have completely failed over and over again on racial justice, whether it was the civil rights movement, whatever was happening with Jim Crow, slavery, an abject failure. And my question to some of those folks is, what have you done to make sure that you correct that failure? What have you put in place in your systems, in your attitudes, in your policies to correct that failure? And I don't think many of them have an answer to say, this is how we've deliberately made sure that we don't embarrass ourselves by being a complete failure on something like social justice again, or something like civil rights again. You have to do things like that. I think the Bible calls us to correct ourselves in very serious and deliberate ways. So that's the first thing I want to make it with some of the folks in Black Lives Matter, because they do have some very strong points that a good portion of the church need to hear and consider in good faith. That said, if you look at the platform, if you look at the conversation about sexual ethics, if you look at the conversation about the family structure, there are some things to be concerned about. And I've also kind of had a conversation with Christians who feel that it's their job to become apologists for that platform. I don't think that we need to act like this secular organization is perfect. Point out the good points that they make, say they have a point here and there, but for some reason we feel like if we say that no, they actually could do this better, that we're giving the folks who don't want to listen anyway a leg up. No, you're being intellectually honest. When I can look at the Black Lives Matter platform and I can say, you know what, that's not biblical, this is not biblical, instead of twisting and turning to kind of make everything biblical, what that does is that gives me a credibility with the people who are really struggling to understand whether they should deal with it or not. If I come in there and I'm trying to be an apologist and make everything seem like it's perfect and no problem, then I should lose credibility. And I've had that conversation on social media and elsewhere. You don't have to defend it like it's the Sermon on the Mount. That platform is not the Sermon on the Mount. The problems with family structure and the questions it raises at best are very unclear and ambiguous. And as somebody who loves Black people, who knows how important the Black family is, I'm not going to affirm anything that's ambiguous or at worst, just unbiblical. Right. So I have a problem when Christians start to say, no, yeah, it says something about we should create tribes and men aren't and we need to kind of push back on the nuclear family and men aren't mentioned in certain parts of that family conversation. And then you find a way to explain that away. You don't have to explain it away. Right. Especially with how serious the family is. Be very clear to say, I don't agree with this. At best, it needs more clarity. They need to clarify this or else I just can't get behind it. And I think that's the best stance for Christians. If you support the statement Black Lives Matter, if you would like to be co-belligerents with the folks in Black Lives Matter, then be honest about the places that, the places where they could do better or that platform is wrong. That gives you credibility to go to other Christians and have a real conversation. Otherwise, they're just going to think you indoctrinated. And I can't really disagree with them if you're not willing to admit some of the flaws.
No, that's great, because I do think it's important that we realize that no organization is above critique, including the church. I mean, Jesus frequently is dealing with religious people. He's frequently rebuking them. He's correcting them. And so if the church isn't above reproach in every sense in terms of how we engage, certainly an organization that in many ways, even who have vocalized kind of their vehemence towards the Christian church. And so that's why I think it's just so important, guys, as you're listening to myself and Justin, that we make that distinction. We are intentional that we affirm the sentiment, but we cannot affirm every aspect of the organization because, like you said, there's an attack on the nuclear family. There's almost an idolization of making single parent families, even when you don't have to. And it's like, no, I mean, we not that single parents are tainted in any way, but if both parents can be there, that's God's design. That's what we should champion. We should talk about the reconciliation, restoring the family. The family in particular within the Black community is in part helped us get through segregation and Jim Crow and the communal aspect of that. Exactly. And God has created the family. This is the first thing you see in the garden is a family. And so I think it's just so important that we make that distinction, that we're clear and concise, about those critiques when they're warranted. And so I just thank you. I thank you for doing that. Have you had any?
I would just add. Let me add one thing just for clarity's sake. I'm just like a lot of other people. I would love. I think every Christian should be able to affirm the phrase Black Lives Matter, that as a statement. What I'm trying to tell people is it does not strengthen your argument in getting people to do that by acting like the organization is biblically sound, right? What I'm saying is you actually get more credibility from critiquing them in an honest way than you would from becoming an apologist and acting like that whole platform is flawless. So I just wanted to make that clear.
Yeah, and I was going to ask as a follow-up, have you had any direct contact with any of the leadership since you're president, you're leading a growing, thriving organization yourself? Clearly, that's a growing and thriving organization. Have you had any contact with them to be able to share some of these concerns?
I mean, on a local level, I've had conversations with some folks in the organization, but it didn't really even go into that conversation. It was more generally about some of the issues that were going on in Atlanta and how we might be able to come together to get to those issues. If given an opportunity to sit down, it's something I could address and say, this is at best unclear what your thinking was behind that. I think those are good conversations to have. I haven't had that conversation with anybody in that leadership, but certainly, and you know, we talk about it in the book. We talk about partnerships and partisanship. In partnerships, you have to be very clear where your interests align and where they, you know, and where they kind of move apart. And so I think sometimes we enter into, especially on the social justice conversation, we enter into partnerships without kind of doing that due diligence beforehand. And so we jump into something that aspects of it aren't biblical, and we're just not aware of that and don't have a plan to make sure that we don't stray away from what's more important, which is our biblical basis and foundation.
Yeah, in many ways, the organization came as a response to the 2013 tragedy of Trayvon Martin, right? And then there was a hashtag, and then the hashtag went beyond that into organizing and grassroots efforts. But there still seems to be a huge divide within the evangelical church about the issue or the reality of police brutality. Again, some well-known evangelical leaders have said it's not a thing. To me, you know, I think that's biblically inaccurate, because you can't affirm total depravity and then say it can't play out in this way. And one of the ways it can play out is a white man in a blue uniform pointing a black gun at an unarmed black or brown man. Right. That's one of the symptoms of total depravity. Doesn't mean all cops are bad. That's not what we're saying. And when we talk about police brutality, we're not only talking about white cops. We're talking about any abuse of power is wrong when you can enact that abuse of power and literally take someone's life. Why is there such an issue to acknowledge that police brutality is a thing? And why do you think there's such a racial divide on that issue?
Pride.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a pride issue. You know, that, you know, the biggest issue to me with that is that's not even the posture of Christianity. The posture of Christianity is not, oh, you say you're hurting, unless you can prove it to me beyond a reasonable doubt, then I don't believe that you're hurting. I don't believe this is an issue. That's just not the posture of Christianity. But the problem is people want to go into the conversation about race, and they want to make sure that they come out of that conversation looking faultless. They want to make sure that you can't say nothing about what my forefathers did, or, you know, the folks in my family did, or the folks in my culture did. I want to make sure that I walk out of there and you know that it's all on you. This is not a Christian way of going about that conversation. We need to enter into conversations when people say that they're hurting and our neighbors are crying out. We need to enter those conversations listening and with a spirit of self-examination. But that's a spirit of self-defense. And it's somebody trying to defend their pride, trying to defend their tribe, to say, we haven't done anything wrong. And I know I know we're perfect. Who had a conversation with Jesus with a perfect narrative and walked away with the perfect narrative? Nobody did. And that type of pride is just so far from what the Bible prescribes for Christians in society, when we know this is a fallen world. So the world is only fallen outside of your tribe. I think when either side says stuff like that, it's just not biblical, and it shows. And the other thing is, the only thing that people that believe it are people that are already indoctrinated to your side. Nobody else believes you. And so, again, you're losing credibility in the conversation. And this is why we find that a lot of white evangelicals really don't have a lot of influence outside of that tribe. People just don't think they're approaching issues generally with a lot of intellectual honesty. That's just not an intellectually honest way to approach the conversation about police brutality, nor is it a Christ-like way to approach it.
No, I'm glad you said that, because, you know, it's interesting that you have to give, in some circles, a theological treatise in order just to receive compassion. I mean, that's just inconsistent with the biblical ethic. Or You mentioned pride, and I think pride also plays in the way of just being evasive. And so the moniker is, it's not a skin issue, it's a sin issue. I agree with that. It is a sin issue, but the Bible names specific sins. The Bible calls out sin by name. And so just to use that phrase in order to not have the conversation, again, is not being authentic, and it's not being consistent with the scriptural narrative. Well, Justin, we talked about the political climate, and, just some ways we can get away from conflating any political party with Christianity. We talked about Black Lives Matter versus the sentiment versus the organization. But I think it's something else we need to talk about, man. You mentioned it earlier, but I want us to go there as it relates to the idea of abortion, because the response is, in particular, Black people. You guys keep talking about police brutality. You keep talking about systemic injustice. How come you guys don't talk about abortion? And so I do think we need to talk about that. So right quickly. This woman on the screen is Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger is the founder of Planned Parenthood, and this woman was racist. She was a eugenicist. She literally wanted to see the end of Black and brown people, and this is the founder. Where the left they've aligned themselves, with this woman and this brand. A good buddy of mine, one of the founders, Sho Baraka, actually addresses this in his album, The Narrative, where he says, fight for justice from creation to the tomb. I know Black lives matter, and they should matter in the womb. And I think that's an excellent quote. When we think about some of the things that are happening here. I want to put this picture up. And I just want to get your first thoughts and kind of let's begin to talk about this as it relates to Black people and abortion, the abortion conversation. Just tell me your initial thoughts when you see this picture, and then why is the narrative that Black people don't care about lives in the womb?
Yeah, I mean, I think that picture is worth 1,000 words. Black life, if we care about Black life, it has to extend to the whole life. And Jerome, that the AND campaign recently, the women of the AND campaign recently did a whole initiative called the Whole Life Project, where we were saying that we're pro-life and pro-woman. And I think one of the biggest problems that we have with this conversation in the African-American community and in other communities is we've allowed ideological tribes to frame this issue for us. And this is one of the main things that the AND campaign talks about. If an issue is framed improperly or a question is framed improperly, then you can end up having two wrong answers, right? So the way that this issue is framed is, do you care about women's health, or do you care about the unborn? Choose one. And we're saying no, that's not how that causes us to get, either way we answer, we're giving a partially wrong answer, right? You can care about women and care about children. And I think even when it comes to the African-American community, I know a lot of folks who are pro-life. So I want to stop the idea that nobody in the African-American community is pro-life. I know a lot of folks that are pro-life. Yeah. And I am too, and grew up in a household that was. And so we need to, sometimes we get a little too far with that. But I think there has been some folks who have bought into that false dichotomy or just kind of gone along with it. So I know, and I won't say any names, but I know a politician who's a Christian. And I was asking, I said, look, this is wrong. Why do you just go along with it with the party? She said, well, that's just the way it is. And that's the thing that Christians can't get into, right? No, that's not just the way that it is. You don't let them frame what's okay for you. And so I would say that we do need to see abortion as a Black Lives Matter issue. But I will push it back against when somebody's asked to care about racial justice, and then we get into the whataboutism. Oh, what about abortion? What about this? No, that's like my wife telling me, hey, why didn't you take out the trash? And I say, oh, why didn't you clean the kitchen? Come on, bro. I got to deal with the question that was asked of me first, right? Yeah. And for Christians, we cannot use stuff like that to deflect, right? Mm-hmm. So for the white evangelical or anybody else who has been asked about racial justice and pointed other people to, the whataboutism of abortion, if you want somebody else to deal with the issue, the issues on their side, deal with yours first. Don't use it as a deflection for something else. That's the first thing that I would say, because it's just not a sincere and honest way to go about the conversation. I will say this, though. The Black community could say more about the abortion issue. It could actually change the whole conversation, right? Because you do have so many pro-life Black Christians that if we were to step in and have a conversation with all our influence in the Democratic Party, we could change that conversation. So I'm not going to come in here either and accuse and do what I accuse others of and acting like we do everything perfectly. We don't. And we need to speak up on that a little more. I think our general...
Right quick.
Go ahead.
Right quick, I want you to continue, but I want some people to see something because we got people on.
Yeah.
One of the things Margaret Sanger led was the Negro Project, and the tool, the strategy of the Negro Project was to get black clergy to buy into the idea of abortion and somehow presenting it as if it was good for black people. Now,
Wow.
this is something very important for us to understand for people watching. Since Roe v. Wade, and this is an alarming stat. U.S. Census data says that there were over 18 million Black American citizens in 1960. Since Roe v. Wade and abortion was legalized in 1973, abortion has killed an estimated 20 million Black babies. All right. So I want you to see that stat, family that are watching this. That means that there have been more Blacks babies killed than our entire population during that time in the 60s. And so I want us to think about that because that is 20 million legacies that have been stripped of life. 20 million legacies that don't see the light of day. And so, and like I said, I'm glad you said that, Jess, because we got to keep it real. We have to talk about this. And to Shobaraka's line, fight for from creation to the tomb. I know Black Lives Matter and they must matter in the womb. I'm gonna put that picture up again. It's a powerful, I think a picture's worth 1,000,000 words here. And in this case, it's worth 20 million babies. And so it's important that we don't skate around this issue. And I refuse to live in a society where an unsafe place for a Black baby is the womb of a Black woman. We cannot let that be the reality. So I just wanted to put that stat in there, and definitely because this is the hot button topic, but a very important topic. So go ahead, Justin. Sorry about that.
And I would caution folks on one other thing. You know, one thing that I found in the secular left does this really well is they will use Blackness to justify an issue that has nothing to do with Blackness. And so I would like to tell people to not fall for that game. Right. We put something about being whole life up and somebody responded, don't you know that they only started caring about that after, sometime slavery or, sometime after Jim Crow, because this, and this, and this. It's really they don't really care. It's just a race, a way for white people to control you or blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of history. A lot of people have done some ugly things and negative things. That ain't the question. The question is whether this is right or wrong. And don't allow people. It's just like, I don't know if you saw the thing that came out and was like, believing in the Bible is whiteness. The nuclear family is whiteness. That's a game. They're running a game on you, right? They're using your identity to control what and to force you to believe what they want you to believe. Being pro-life is not whiteness. You talk about Fannie Lou Hamer. You talk about many folks in the black tradition of the church have been pro-life for years and years and years. Don't allow people to attach race to this issue. And now you're not looking at whether it's right or wrong. You're looking at whether you identify with one side or the other, right? And so you can use all the history you want. I'm not going to defend everything that the pro-life movement has done. I'm not going to defend everything that the folks over there do in regard to other race issues. I'm going to look at whether this is right or wrong. And according to the Bible, it is wrong. And it has nothing else. I'm not going to let anybody use my race or anything else to change my mind on that. I have to be biblically sound. And so I just want Christians, and especially, Christians of color, not to fall for the game of calling something whiteness and then, in a condescending way, expecting us to react kind of like a dog response, react to the fact that you say it's the opposite of our race. We're smarter than that. We can't fall for them games.
No, yeah, you mentioned a couple of, just leaders. There have been tons of, leaders, Black Christian leaders within the church. And I do think in some ways it's a misnomer because the pro-life voices within our community don't get the same play, especially from the left. But what about this, man? Because you talked about this false equivalence of somehow pro-life being whiteness. But there's also the false narrative of pro-life being coonery, that somehow if you're Black and you have more conservative values as it relates to the sanctity of life, that you're a coon. So, man, break that down for us.
Yeah, Where do you begin with a statement that's that ridiculous? First of all, it lacks historical context, right?
Absolutely.
The idea that secular progressivism is native to African Americans is the most ridiculous thing that I've ever heard in my life. Secular progressive, there is nothing more Western and European and elite than secular progressivism, right? So the ideas that where we get these ideas, eugenics and how we should look at life, that whole movement comes out of Western, Western thought. And so it really upsets me when people act like secular progressivism came from the roots of, the South where Black people were, came out of, somewhere in Africa. That's something that's extremely Western European. It doesn't mean it's automatically wrong, but it means that you lack historical context and understanding to act like that's a natural position that Black people should take. Right. So I think we have to look at the history of it. Again, we have to read about Fannie Lou Hamer, who was somebody who had experienced certain things and people controlling her body and doing things to her body that she didn't like. And so she was a very serious advocate when it came to pro-life issues. Look at somebody who we can still reach out and talk to, who is Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner, a sister who has been around for a minute and has done so many things for the Black community. And if you talk to her, very clearly is pro-life, right? You can't come to her and tell her anything about the civil rights movement. She was there for it, and she understands how a lot of people felt about it. So, folks can say what they want to say. We can use all type of rhetorical devices, but most of those rhetorical devices are not biblical, and they completely lack historical context. Many and most Black Christians coming up were not okay with children being killed in the womb, and that's real. I mean, there's no real argument against that.
Yeah, Jasmine Jones said the whole of Black Life Matters, and there are plenty of Black folks who are pro-life and pro-women, as you said earlier, man. I just think it's just so important that we do talk about this, that we can be, as the saying goes, you can walk and chew gum, right? We can walk and chew gum. So we can be pro-life and anti-police brutality. You can be both. And again, I love the term you guys are using, whole life, because it is important that we make this distinction. If you only care about me in the womb, but you don't care about me outside of the womb, you're not actually pro-life, you're pro-birth. To be pro-life, or again, to use the AND campaign's term, to have a whole life biblical ethic, we care about lives in the womb, and we care about human flourishing outside of the womb. And so it's just so important that, we talk about these things. I didn't want us to have this conversation and not be intentional about addressing, that elephant in the room, which I think in many ways is a smokescreen, because there are millions of Black people that are pro-life and understand the value of Black life in the womb, which is why we're so passionate about Black lives outside of the womb. This is why we protest. This is why we fight for legislation, because we understand the whole of life. Justin, man, just any final thoughts before we kind of wrap this up?
No, I would just say, on all the issues that we've talked about, the issue is really framing things in a biblical way. And if we frame things in a biblical way, we find that it's often not as limited as people make it, right? It's not women or children, it's women and children, and making sure that we care about both of them. But you cannot trust conservatism or progressivism to frame the issues for you and think that you're going to be faithful. You've got to do that for yourself. And actually, we've got to do that together by running all these issues through biblical scrutiny, man. And I just appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk about it, man, and look forward to working with you on all these issues and moving forward.
Well, again, Justin, thank you so much just for coming on. Thank you for just your wealth of knowledge. Thank you for your expertise. Guys, we want to continue this conversation. So we hope that you will, you'll like, you'll share, you'll subscribe, so people can grow from this, and we continue the conversation. We'll continue to provide more content here on The Urban Perspective. I definitely plan on bringing Justin back. Next time, maybe we'll have a Q&A, just so people can engage with some of the things you're teaching us. So again, guys, thank you for tuning in. Please share this. You've been tuned into The Urban Perspective. God bless you. I love you. Peace.